Section 18 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmond Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 14. The Triple Alliance and Peace of X La Chapelle. 1. Various projects of Charles. Underlying the other causes of the parliamentary attack upon Clarendon had been the conviction that he was directing English policy in the French interest. It was this jealousy of the French power, the jealousy of the nation as distinct from the king, which now led to the formation of a great European coalition against Louis. The project of a close alliance between England and the Republic had been discussed even before the close of the late war. It first took shape in the mind of Sir William Temple, an intimate friend of De Witt and the most cultured of English diplomatists. He had fretted under the success of Louis in fostering a war whereby the two great naval and Protestant powers destroyed one another's strength, and he longed to repay him in kind. De Witt had listened to his proposals readily. The sole object of the Grand Pensionary was to stay the approach of France towards the Dutch frontier, and he had tried in vain to induce Louis to pledge himself to hold his hand. He had, too, reason to hope that Sweden, sore at Lyon's arrogance, would throw in her lot with that of the two other Protestant powers. His agent in London was therefore directed to work upon the fears of Charles, by declaring that if England did not join the Republic, the Dutch would be driven to a close alliance with Louis, and upon his pride, by putting before him the headship of a great Protestant coalition. At the same time he tried to bring Louis to terms by letting him know that on the one hand he was treating directly with Castel Rodrigo, and on the other had good hopes of a league with Austria, Sweden, and England. The implied threat drew from Louis nothing but a curt and angry reply. The focus of diplomatic intrigue was now transferred to London. Rouvigny, the French ambassador, a personal friend of Clarendon, was dispatched to England in the utmost haste, well furnished with funds to enforce his arguments, and with instructions to renew to Charles himself the promise of French help against his own subjects. Before, however, he reached London, Clarendon had fallen, and he had to deal with Buckingham and Arlington, between whom the power which the Chancellor had left behind was now divided. He was received with perfect frankness. Charles expressed the warmest personal regard for Louis, but declared that Parliament would never consent to an alliance with France, and among all whom Rouvigny approached, he found the conviction that England would not stand idle while France was taking the whole of the Spanish Low Countries. Louis, on receiving Rouvigny's report, showed the liveliest anxiety. To soothe the parliamentary opposition, rendered keener by the news that Clarendon had landed in France, he forbade the fallen minister to come to Paris. He instructed Rouvigny to press upon Charles the shame of being a slave to his Parliament, and the prospect of avenging the insult at Chatham. Concealing the fact that he was at the moment in active negotiations with De Witt, Charles replied by hinting at generous offers from Spain. A large supply of ready money, a part of the French conquests in the Spanish Low Countries, and important commercial advantages might, however, move him. Louis at once, October 1667, instructed Rouvigny to promise the money demanded, increased facilities for trade with France and the Spanish Low Countries, and French aid in ships and money to conquer the Spanish possessions in the West Indies. The question of places in the Spanish Low Countries was, however, waived. The diplomatic contest between France and the Republic was accentuated by the personal rivalry of Buckingham and Arlington. The former, a vain man, devoid alike of principle and political insight, was wholly in the French interest. He hoped to receive the command of an English contingent in the service of Louis. Arlington, equally vain and unscrupulous, had succeeded to the principal direction of foreign affairs by his evident capacity for business and coolness of judgment. he may indeed be regarded almost as a statesman of the first rank. It was greatly in his favour that he was the only one of Charles's ministers with a knowledge of European languages sufficient to enable him to converse easily with foreign ambassadors. He perfectly understood the temper of the English people, and having married a lady from Holland, was inclined to the Dutch rather than the French connection. The opportunity now offered him of thwarting Buckingham tended in the same direction. While therefore engaged in apparent concert with the latter in preliminaries with Ruvigny, which he had no intention of seriously pursuing, he at the same moment busied himself with Charles's sanction, but without Buckingham's knowledge, in direct and serious negotiations with De Witt. In pursuance of this policy, terms were placed before Louis in December of a nature likely to ensure their rejection. Louis in return sent the draft of a treaty equally distasteful to the English government. Charles hereupon asserted that England was so exhausted by the late war that repose was absolutely necessary, and that he was therefore determined upon a course of strict neutrality. Louis was compelled to hide his irritation at this, the first serious check to his diplomatic success, by proclaiming that such neutrality was really more to his interest than war, inasmuch as the Dutch, no longer fearing the union of England and France, would lay aside much of their jealousy with respect to his movements. Privately, however, he expressed profound disappointment. It is a lively illustration of the political morality of the time that simultaneously with these negotiations Charles was offering to Spain too his active alliance. His terms were, as always, ready money and commercial expansion. He demanded a heavy subsidy, permission to send a fixed number of ships for unrestricted trade to Buenos Ayres and the Philippines, privileges in Antwerp, which was again to become the rival of Amsterdam, and through the exercise of Spanish influence, free trade with the Hanse towns. Both the poverty and the pride of Spain stood in the way of the acceptance of such terms. 2. The Triple Alliance. Nothing therefore now remained, if England was to take action at all, but the acceptance of the union with the Republic proposed by De Witt, to compel Louis to bind himself to one or other of his alternatives, and to this, under Arlington's influence, Charles now found decisive reasons for turning. Most of all, the hope that such an alliance might put to rest the increasing clamour of Parliament was an argument which influenced a king who habitually acted along the line of least resistance. Early in January 1668, Temple was sent off in haste to the Hague. Two difficulties threatened to retard the conclusion of the alliance. De Witt had dealt a severe blow to the Orange faction, and had offended Charles by obtaining the perpetual separation of the stadtholdership from the command of the land and sea forces. To this he wished for Charles's acquiescence, and he now secured this acquiescence by affecting to hang back from the treaty on which the king was for the moment bent. The other difficulty was that, while haste and secrecy were of the last necessity, the peculiar constitution of the Dutch government, which required the sanction of all treaties by the Provincial Estates, rendered haste and secrecy impossible. It happened, however, that during the late war the Provincial Estates had for urgency delegated their power to a commission of 8 members, which was still undissolved. To this body the business was referred, and upon their agreement the treaty was at once ratified by the States General. Temple thus completely outwitted d'Estrades, the French ambassador at the Hague, who reported to Lionne that some arrangement was in the wind, but that it would be easy to secure its defeat when brought, as the constitution demanded, before the Provincial Estates. On January 13th, 1668, Temple succeeded in concluding 3 separate treaties. By the first, each power was bound to assist the other if attacked in Europe, with 40 ships of the line, 6,000 infantry, and 400 cavalry. By the second, they were to endeavour to restore peace between France and Spain on the basis of the alternatives, to obtain from Louis a cessation of arms until the end of May, to guarantee the cession by Spain of the places to which he would become entitled, and finally to induce him, under this guarantee, to renounce further conquests in the Spanish Low Countries, even if force should be found necessary to compel Spain to observe the agreement. In these two treaties all sign of menace to Louis had been sedulously avoided. The third, which was strictly secret, was of a different character. It provided that whichever of the parties refused to consent to the alternatives, force should be used to compel her to accept peace. If France were recalcitrant, the war upon her should not cease until she had been reduced to the limits imposed by the Peace of the Pyrenees. No protest was made against the future claim of Louis to the Spanish monarchy, and it was doubtless hoped that, since the conditions of peace were those proposed by Louis himself, the secret article would never be called into play. To this treaty Sweden gave her adhesion in April, conditionally upon obtaining from Spain the payments to which she laid claim. Such, however, was the poverty of Spain that she was unable to find the money, and the difficulty was got over only by England and the Republic guaranteeing the payment at a future time. The signature of Sweden was affixed on May 15th. The treaty has thus become known as the Triple Alliance. Important as the Triple Alliance was, both in its immediate effects and as the first formal expression of European resistance to the aggressions of Louis, it was, so far as Charles was concerned, a piece of gross political knavery. His hopes were in reality steadily fixed on France, and on the day after the treaty was signed he wrote both to his sister Henrietta, who was in the confidence of Louis, and to Louis himself, to explain his action as forced upon him by his subjects. He had, too, the special meanness to declare that it was the Dutch and not he who had proposed and pressed the matter forward. By the secret treaty he had cleverly and fatally compromised the Dutch in the eyes of Louis, and had thus secured their isolation, if ever he should himself desire to attack them again. 3. Peace of X La Chapelle. In the face of this coalition Louis might well pause in his career. The peace which Portugal had made with Spain naturally tended in the same direction, since it set free to fight in the Spanish Netherlands whatever forces Spain still possessed. The three events, the Partition Treaty, the Triple Alliance, and the peace of Portugal with Spain, now brought about a short period of repose for Europe. But Louis had meanwhile had time to strike another blow. On the mediation of the Pope he had, in September 1667, granted a truce of 3 months. At its conclusion, in January 1668, the Diet asked for a further period of 3 months, during which terms might be arranged, but Louis, while consenting to keep open the negotiations, refused a suspension of arms. The confidence of Castel Rodrigo, who declared that nature herself would enforce a suspension, incited him to an unexpected enterprise. Winter campaigns had been till then almost unknown in European warfare, but Louis broke through the general practice. He determined to overrun Franche-Comté, which lay temptingly open to attack. His preparations were rapidly made. A corps of 15,000 men were placed under the command of Condé. On the 2nd, after sending notice of his intention to all the European powers, he left Saint-Germain. In a fortnight all was over. The Spaniards could oppose only 12,000 disorganized troops to Condé's corps d'élite, and by the 19th, before Europe had recovered from her surprise, the only places capable of offering resistance were in Louis's hands. He now received from the English and Dutch envoys the formal announcement of the Triple Alliance. Their communication was couched in terms of studied compliment, the whole stress being laid upon the intended compulsion of Spain. In accordance with the treaty, they asked for a suspension of arms until the end of May 1668. To this Louis replied that Spain, by making peace with Portugal, showed her intention of continuing the war, and that to grant the suspension demanded would merely give her 3 months in which to strengthen herself, while he, with 100,000 men ready to march, had to stand by with folded arms. To show his anxiety to satisfy Europe, however, he would hold his hand until May 16th, upon an undertaking that the ratifications of the treaty with Spain on the basis of the alternatives were exchanged by that date, and would even give back to Spain all he might have taken since March 31st, the date he had originally offered for the conclusion of an arrangement. This decision was arrived at only after long consideration. In the unprepared condition of the other powers, no less than in his own readiness for attack, in the advice of Condé and Turenne, and in the feeling of Paris, where the warlike spirit was so strong that it was a mortal sin even to mention peace, Louis had every temptation to immediate war. Moreover, he had, through the treachery of Charles, learned with excessive indignation of the secret provisions of the Triple Alliance. Other considerations, however, prevailed. The necessity of garrisoning any towns he might capture would enfeeble his army, while a general European coalition would probably at once follow any further attack. War would but consolidate the Triple Alliance, which was sure before long, if he were moderate, to fall asunder by its own weight. Franche-Comté could be rendered powerless before he gave it up, and the towns which he already possessed in the Spanish Low Countries would place the rest at his mercy when a more favourable moment should arrive. He therefore, on April 15th, 1668, agreed to the following terms. Up to May 31st he would accept whichever of the alternatives Spain might choose. During the next 2 months he should raise his terms. To the first alternative he should add the possession of Luxemburg or Lille and Tournai, to the second that of Franche-Comté, Cambrai, and the Cambrai Sea. Should nothing have been settled by the end of July, the whole question would be open to revision. England and the Republic bound themselves meanwhile to attack Spain after May 31st, should she refuse to concur, reserving for their action the north-eastern, while he dealt with the south-western portion of the still unoccupied part of the Spanish Low Countries. Without resources or prospects of efficient help, Castel Rodrigo at length gave way, though the pride, dilatoriness, and formality of the court of Madrid so effectually seconded his reluctance that it was not until May 29th that the treaty was finally concluded. Looking more to a future war with France than to the present peace, he decided to accept the second alternative, since the first, which included the French possession of Franche-Comté, would have closed all communication between the Spanish Low Countries, the Empire, and Lorraine. The Dutch, too, he felt, would by this choice be alarmed at the proximity of France, and would be more interested in the continued defence of the rest of the Spanish Low Countries. The advantages gained by Louis were immense. Victory had, as it were, been given him by compulsion, and he appeared before Europe as the apostle of moderation. Confronted by a formidable alliance, he had himself laid down the conditions of peace, and those conditions contained not one word to hamper his action in that which especially caused the fears of Europe, the prosecution of his claim to the Spanish monarchy. The fortresses of Charleroi, Binche, Ath, Douai, with Scarpe, Tournai, Oudenarde, Lille, Armentières, Courtrai, Berg, and Furnes, with their districts, which were now secured to him by treaty, constituted a veritable frontière de fer, the impregnable north-eastern frontier of France for which Henry IV, Richelieu, and Mazarin had all striven. Paris was now the real centre of the country, and the way for the next step to European supremacy was open and easy. End of section 18. Section 19 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmond Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 15. Complete failure of Charles's attempts at toleration after the fall of Clarendon, 1667 to 1671. Number 1. Toleration during the recess of Parliament. The fall of Clarendon constituted a definite point of departure in the history of the reign of Charles II, for it removed one obstacle to the fulfilment of his purpose of resting his power upon the goodwill and gratitude of dissent. Buckingham and Arlington were naturally ready to espouse a policy opposed to that of Clarendon, but their private inclinations also led them towards toleration. Buckingham, as the husband of Fairfax's daughter and the patron of Protestant discontent, Arlington as a sympathizer with the Catholics, even if he were not one himself. As long as the recess lasted they had their way. The penal statutes were ignored, the prisons set open, and the meeting-houses again thronged. The Presbyterians received ostentatious favour, while many old Commonwealth men again appeared in public. A conference was held in which Orlando Bridgeman, who as Lord Keeper of the Seals had succeeded Clarendon, Lord Chief Justice Hale, and some of the purest characters of both the Church and the dissenting bodies took part, and a bill was drafted whereby, upon some alterations of ceremonies and the form of ordination, the Presbyterians were to re-enter the Church, while the other sects, whose principles forbade association with the state establishment, were to have 3 years' full indulgence. It was confidently hoped that Parliament, rendered tractable by the Triple Alliance, would give their consent to this proposal. This hope soon proved groundless. The Commons had indeed overthrown Clarendon because he had resisted their encroachments on the prerogative and was thought to favour France, not because he had opposed toleration. Upon this question they had always been more Clarendonian than Clarendon himself, and it was now found that their views were but strengthened by their late successes. 2. Persecution during the session. The intentions of the king had already leaked out, and the Commons met February 10, 1668, in a state of excessive irritation, to consider the speech from the throne. The usual demand for money occupied the first place. Then followed a request that they would seriously think of some course to beget a better union and composure in the minds of my Protestant subjects in matters of religion. All mention of Catholics was carefully avoided. The reply of the Commons struck the prevailing note of distrust. A subsidy of £300,000 was indeed voted, but with a demand for definite application. A searching inquiry was instituted into the mismanagement of the Dutch war, and especially into the Chatham disgrace. They next sought to restore the abandoned safeguards to the Triennial Bill by entrusting the Chancellor with the duty of issuing writs should the king fail to do so within 3 years of a dissolution. But the dislike to stultify themselves so soon, the indecency of pushing the king so hard, and the fact that in Sweden, the only other country then under parliamentary government, writs were issued by officials only during a minority, furnished arguments to the court party, and a technical irregularity in the introduction of the bill was made an excuse for waiving the question. Language of unusual boldness was however heard in the debate, and phrases such as "compelling the king by law" were significant of the rising anger and distrust. On the main issue there was among the vast majority no hesitation. Charles was at once petitioned to proclaim the suppression of all unlawful assemblies, whether Papist or Protestant. He well knew that upon his answer depended a continuance of the supplies which his extravagance rendered necessary. The short-lived hopes of the dissenters came to an end. The desires of the king, the influence of Buckingham and Arlington, and the wishes of the best men of both parties were alike powerless before the angry determination of the Commons. On March 11th they settled down to the consideration of the last part of the king's speech. The minority spoke with boldness and force. They urged that if a man finds not his account in the government he lives under, he will never labour to support it, and they represented vividly the evils which the persecuting acts were causing to trade. The dread of a standing army was appealed to on both sides. It was alternately declared that toleration with its consequent anarchy, and repression with its consequent discontent, would alike demand the maintenance of a military force. The violent churchmen used the old language. The Presbyterians had, it was true, brought about the Restoration and were supporters of monarchy, and yet their tenets were destructive of proper government. The king, but minister honorum, greater than any one man, but less than the people. Salus populi suprema lex. They must not be allowed a footing, lest they destroy the whole. The charge that, though by profession men of mercy, churchmen carried things with excessive severity, was met by the question, must a father yield authority to his son? Leave was at length given to introduce a bill to continue the conventicle acts. On April 8th, the proposal that the king should be asked to hold a conference of divines was fully debated. It was argued that severity did but make dissent respectable, that the justices refused to convict because the wife and children of the offender became chargeable on the parish, and that it was dangerous to make laws too big to be executed. Waller likened the Church to an elder brother among the Turks who strangles his brethren lest they should threaten the succession, and he bade the House take notice that Empson and Dudley were hanged, not for extortion, but for pressing the penal laws. The Tolerationists had the speaking to themselves, but the majority had the votes, and the proposal was rejected by 176 to 70. 3 weeks later, on the bill for continuing the conventicle acts, the advocates of severity had their way. In vain they were urged to make the fire in the chimney and not in the middle of the room, and warned against making it so hot that it would burn both the victims and their executioners. The prevailing sentiment was probably interpreted by a speaker who declared that if the Catholics did not come under this bill, he should ask leave to bring the one to tolerate popery. The bill was carried by 144 to 73. For a while the attention of the House was distracted by a famous controversy with the Lords, embittered by the jealousy aroused by their frequent and serious assumptions and extension of power since the Restoration. A merchant named Skinner, who complained that the East India Company had seized his ship and cargo and assaulted himself, laid his cause before the Privy Council instead of first appealing to the law courts. The Privy Council referred the matter to the Lords, and the Lords awarded him heavy damages. The Company thereupon appealed to the Commons, who at once denied the legality of an original appeal to the Lords in a case with which the ordinary courts were competent to deal, declared the action of the Lords to be a breach of privilege, and ordered Skinner into custody. They passed to a vote that anybody who assisted in carrying out the order of the Lords should be deemed a betrayer of the liberties of the Commons of England and an infringer of the privileges of the House. The Lords thereupon committed to prison Sir Samuel Barnardiston, chairman of the Company and a member of the Commons, and fined him £500. So violent was the quarrel and so complete the deadlock that the opportunity was a good one for seeing whether, if time were given for passions to cool, the Commons might not at the same time be induced to waive their opposition to toleration. Charles therefore, on May 8, 1668, ordered the House to adjourn itself, and afterwards by successive adjournments put off its meeting until October 19, 1669. During this long interval the question of a dissolution was again earnestly discussed. Not only were both Buckingham and Arlington anxious to avoid parliamentary attack, but they were confident of the full support of the Dissenters for a new election, since their condition had again been ameliorated as soon as Parliament had been adjourned. The more pronounced sectarians had been secured by Buckingham, and had offered a large contribution towards the king's expenses in return for the indulgence he promised. Charles had himself received a Presbyterian deputation, and declared he still hoped to see their body before long within the national church. It is probable that a dissolution would have secured his objects, but the old fears again prevailed. Monk, who still possessed great influence, urged that a Parliament composed largely of the oppressed would seek for vengeance on their oppressors, and exclaimed that rather than wait for that day he would leave England. Charles determined once more to face his old Parliament, the meeting of which could not indeed be longer delayed. During the recess a spasmodic attempt had been made to bring the expenditure within the revenues secured to the king for life, but economy was an exotic at court, and money was again absolutely necessary. The Houses met on October 19th, 1669. Had Charles been careful to maintain at least a moderate execution of the penal laws, it is possible that the Commons might at their coming together have accepted some indulgence for Protestant dissent. As it was, they assembled possessed more than ever with the doctrines that Catholicism was their arch enemy, and that an overwhelming and exclusive Anglican ascendancy was the only means whereby to fight this enemy. Sheldon had collected ex parte information as to the character of the conventicles, and even before the meeting of Parliament had carried it to Charles and forced him to issue a fresh proclamation to enforce the laws. The session began with a strict examination into the public accounts. The king was then thanked for his recent proclamation. The Commons next appointed a committee to inquire into the holding of conventicles in London, which had aroused a blind dread of the return to a Commonwealth regime. The committee reported that such meetings were an affront to government and an imminent danger to Parliament and the general peace. Monk was deputed to suppress them, and it is noteworthy that this suppression had now become a matter of pure police. The meetings were to be put down as politically dangerous. Religion was not named. The House then returned to the Skinner dispute, justified the unrestricted right of petitioning the Commons, which the Lords had called in question, and again declared the action of the Upper House in claiming original jurisdiction subversive of the rights both of themselves and of the subject. They asserted further that should the Lords at any time give a decision contrary to law, the subject had a right to appeal to the Commons. The dispute was never settled, but the claim of the Lords to original jurisdiction was allowed to lapse and has never been reasserted. Somewhat later the Commons practically defeated the Lords upon another question of great constitutional importance, their claim to make alterations in money bills. Such a claim had been made and either allowed or contested many times without a final decision being arrived at. At length, in April 1671, the Lords reduced the amount of an imposition on sugar, and this led to a resolution of the Lower House to the effect that in all aids given to the king by the Commons, the rate of tax ought not to be altered by the Lords. The exclusive title of the Commons to the giving aids, the only poor thing the Commons can value themselves upon to their prince, or in other words, the only real hold they have upon the crown, was, in the words of the Attorney General at the conference between the Houses, so fundamental that I cannot give a reason for it, for that would be a weakening of the Commons' right and privilege, which we can never depart from, being affirmatively possessed of it in all ages and negatively as to the Lords. The Lords, strong in the absence of proof to this effect, brought forward many precedents to the contrary, the relevancy and import of which was, however, challenged with great subtlety by the managers for the Commons. The question came to an end with the session, and, like that of the judicature, has never been formally settled. But, as with the latter, the Lords have tacitly given up the point, for though they have not acknowledged the privilege of the Commons further than as regards the originating of money bills, they have, on the other hand, never seriously questioned their right to the absolute adjustment of all questions of taxation and supply. Hopeless of gaining his objects, Charles, on December 11th, 1669, once more prorogued Parliament, and thus ended a session which, lasting since February 10th, 1668, had not passed a single act. The supply which had been voted him was insufficient for the wide-reaching purposes which it will be seen he had in view, and he refused to accept it. He was already deep in secret negotiations with Louis, presently to be related, and he had hoped for assistance from Parliament large enough to enable him to treat with that monarch on independent terms. The jealous parsimony of the Commons, who refused so much as to take his debts into consideration, changed his views. He determined to look to France for the money. When Parliament met for a new session on February 14, 1670, an unusual scene was witnessed. For the first time in English history, the sovereign, in opening the proceedings, was attended with military pomp. It can hardly be doubted that his design was thus to accustom the people to the idea of a standing army. He met the Houses with confidence begotten by his dealings with Louis, and addressed them stilo minaci et imperatorio. But he had another reason for confidence. He had no intention of hampering himself by a continuance of the quarrel. On the contrary, he was resolved to extract from Parliament an unstinted supply, which he would use for the objects not distasteful to it. He knew the one condition necessary, and he cynically determined to offer it himself. His speech did not for once contain a word about toleration. The Commons understood that they might have their swing of persecution. They showed their instant recognition of the fact by voting a supply of £300,000 a year for 8 years. The Skinner dispute having been got out of the way by his sensible proposal that all the records connected with it should be erased, Charles left them without demur to settle down to their favourite work. So successful was this complete surrender of the policy which he had pursued since his restoration, that, in the words of Andrew Marvell, the king was never since his coming in, nay, all things considered, no king since the conquest, so absolutely powerful at home. On March 2nd, the bill for suppressing conventicles passed its second reading on the old ground that seditious sectaries, under pretence of tender consciences, do contrive insurrections at their meetings. It consisted of the former Act of 1664, with somewhat slighter penalties for the listeners, but with the addition of clauses which rendered it far more severe and thorough in application. Preachers and teachers were liable to a fine of £20 for the first and £40 for the second offence. Constables withholding information were to be fined £5, and justices of the peace who refused to convict were to pay £100 for every such refusal. Informers were further encouraged by the promise of half the fine. To protect the arbitrary execution of the law, it was decided that if anyone appealed against a prosecution and was nonsuited, he should be mulcted in treble costs, while the climax of injustice was reached by the enactment that all clauses shall be construed most largely and beneficially for the suppressing conventicles, and for the justification and encouragement of all persons to be employed in the execution thereof. No warrant shall be made void for any default in form, and if a person fly from one county or corporation to another, his goods and chattels shall be seizable wherever they are found. This inhuman act did not pass without protest. It was argued that men have a kindness for persecuted people ever since Henry VIII and Mary. The dissenters, it was said, are like children's tops, whip them and they stand upright, let them alone and they fall. A man that has no preaching near him, said Colonel Birch, an old Commonwealth man, will get it where he can. Is it reasonable to punish men when they must go 4 or 5 miles for a sermon? To whip them and not to be able to tell them why you do so is unreasonable, they having no churches in many places to go to. When Waller demanded that the conventicles should have no severer penalties than the Papists, he laid himself open to the obvious retort that was just none at all, and a reference to Louis XIV, who had solved the religious difficulty in France by allowing the Huguenots set and limited places of worship, was not likely to have much weight with an assembly to whom the name of France had become hateful. The Lords eagerly seconded the Commons in passing the bill. They attached to it, however, 2 provisos, the first to insist upon their own immunity from search, except by a warrant from the king under his sign manual or in presence of the Lord Lieutenant. The second ran thus: provided always that neither this act nor anything therein contained shall extend to invalidate or avoid his Majesty's supremacy in ecclesiastical affairs, or to destroy any of his Majesty's rights, powers, or prerogatives belonging to the imperial crown of this realm, or at any time exercised or enjoyed by himself or any of his Majesty's royal predecessors, but that his Majesty, his heirs and successors may from time to time, and at all times hereafter, exercise and enjoy all such powers and authorities aforesaid, as fully and as amply as himself or any of his predecessors have or might have done the same, anything in this act or any other law, statute, or usage to the contrary notwithstanding. It was not probable that the Commons would pass an amendment under cover of which the dispensing power might have been legally exercised. The words in italics were rejected by 122 to 68, and the Lords wisely refrained from insisting upon their view. On April 11th, 1670, Charles gave his assent to the bill. Sheldon hounded on the bishops, and so severely was the act executed that a trustworthy witness declared soon afterwards that there was scarcely a conventicle to be heard all over England. Amid all this senseless cruelty, one advance in constitutional liberty deserves to be recorded. The Quakers were especially obnoxious to the law. Finding the usual place of meeting in Gracechurch Street closed by soldiers, the celebrated William Penn, the most eminent of their body, addressed the people in the open street. The Conventicle Act not technically touching this meeting, Penn and another Quaker, William Mead, were indicted at the Old Bailey on September 1st, 1670, for preaching to an unlawful, seditious, and riotous assembly which had met together with force and arms. The trial which followed is notable in the history of English liberty, for the jury for the first time asserted the right of juries to decide in opposition to the ruling of the court. They brought in a verdict declaring Penn and Mead guilty of speaking in Gracechurch Street, but refused to add to an unlawful assembly. Then, as the pressure from the bench increased, and as they were sent back time after time without food, light, fire, or tobacco, they first acquitted Mead, while returning their original verdict against Penn, and then, when that verdict was not admitted, gave in their final answer, not guilty, for both. The Recorder of London fined the jurymen 40 marks each for contumacy, and in default of payment imprisoned them, whereupon they vindicated and established for ever the right they had claimed of finding verdicts against the ruling of the bench in an action before the Court of Common Pleas, when the Lord Chief Justice Vaughan declared their imprisonment illegal. Protestant nonconformity being now out of the way, the Commons were at liberty to attack the other wing of the forces hostile to Anglican supremacy. On March 10th, 1671, a remarkable petition was forwarded to the king, in which was set forth at length the causes of the increase of popery and the remedies held to be necessary. All popish priests and Jesuits were to be banished, with the exception of those attached by treaty to the Queen's household and to the foreign embassies. The existing laws against popish recusants were to be rigidly enforced. Attendance at the chapels, which by the exceptions mentioned were left unmolested, was to be forbidden to the king's subjects. No civil or military office was for the future to be held by a papist or one justly suspected to be so. All Catholic schools were to be closed and the teachers punished. Plunkett, Catholic Primate of Ireland, and Peter Talbot, titular Archbishop of Dublin, were to be arrested and sent to England for trial. To the demands for the banishment of priests and Jesuits, and for the enforcement of the penal laws against popish recusants, Charles yielded at once. Opinion had not, however, yet travelled so far as to force him to grant the rest. Being now secure of a further supply, the payment for this new surrender, Charles immediately prorogued the Parliament, which did not meet again for business until February 4th, 1672. Before that time, the great crisis of the reign had been reached. End of section 19. Section 20 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmond Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 16. Preparations of Louis for the invasion of the United Provinces. Part 1. Number 1. The Treaty of Dover, June 1st, 1670. The Triple Alliance had been entered into by Charles against his personal inclinations. No one in his confidence regarded it as more than a temporary expedient, for the disruptive forces were as permanent as those which secured it were fleeting. The king's antipathy to the Dutch was reinforced by desire of avenging the Chatham disgrace. The same informal war of merchants wherever the two countries met in competition for trade, as had preluded the late struggle, was being waged, and the old dispute of the flag had been revived. On the very day when London was blazing with bonfires to celebrate the conclusion of peace, Clifford was heard to declare that for all the rejoicing there must soon be another war. That Louis should contentedly accept this rebuff at the hands of the Dutch was still less to be expected. As republicans, as traders, as Protestants, they were the objects of his haughty contempt. As promoters of the Triple Alliance, with its secret articles, they were the objects of his bitter anger. The arrogance of speech, in which they were unwisely indulging their fanfaronnade de pêcheurs, an arrogance exhibited especially in the medal in which France was represented as the sun, which Louis had adopted as the symbol of his grandeur, stayed in his course by the Republic, so rankled in his mind that he never, he says, entered his council without thinking how to make them pay dearly for the great role they had assumed. But before attacking them, he set to work to remove from them all possible sources of support, to destroy the coalition limb by limb, and he began with England. It is a mistake to regard Charles in what followed as making a surrender of himself to Louis. He was for the time master of his own game, and he exacted his own terms. The game was not an easy one to play. He was to break off an alliance upon which Parliament was most earnestly bent. He was to enter into fellowship with the representative of European aggression and Catholic despotism, and these were precisely what Parliament most dreaded. He had, too, to deal with the divisions in his own council. The frothy egotism of Buckingham was enlisted on the side of France, while Arlington openly expressed the opinion that Louis was pretending to universal monarchy and that his wings must be clipped. The first approaches of Louis, April and May 1668, were frustrated by Arlington's action. When Ruvigny asked what offers he might place before his master, he insisted that the first proposals should come from France, and in the teeth of Buckingham's influence induced the king to send Temple as ambassador to the Hague, a step which, from Temple's well-known sympathies, could only mean a determination to maintain the existing alliance. But Louis was not discouraged, for he had received the private assurances of Charles that he would willingly treat as between gentlemen, and that he preferred his word to all the parchment in the world. He now replaced Ruvigny, whose Protestantism unfitted him for the work in hand, by Colbert de Croissy, brother of his great finance minister, with instructions at all cost to secure Arlington. The strictest secrecy was to be observed, but since Charles had broken a previous informal agreement, any fresh understanding must be precise and signed by the commissioners of the two kings. At the outset he again met with disappointment. Charles frankly told Colbert, August 1668, that he was almost the only man in his dominions in Louis's interest. Arlington declared that trade was the English idol, and any alliance would be judged by that test. Colbert decided that it would be waste of money to offer him the lavish bribe which Louis had suggested. At one point, however, Arlington as well as Buckingham could be reached. The return of Clarendon, then an exile in France, would have meant to them political downfall. Harping skilfully upon this fear, Louis so far succeeded that in February 1669 Arlington himself made advances to Colbert. This change of tone was, however, probably due far more to another event. The Duke of York had lately declared his conversion to Catholicism, and with all a convert's ardour was urging his brother to the same course. Arlington was warmly attached to Catholic views. He had now a good excuse for deserting the Dutch and ranging himself on the side to which he knew his master inclined. From this moment he became the eager promoter of the treaty. Charles had hitherto sought favour for the Catholics under cover of toleration for Protestant dissent. For Protestant dissent as such he had no sympathy, and he threw aside without reluctance that part of his scheme. The other part, however, was always actively present in his mind. The political view of the matter was as strong as the religious. Only under a Catholic constitution, he said, might a king of England hope to become absolute. But an influence of a more personal kind was acting upon the king. If there was one being for whom he felt a genuine affection, it was his sister Henrietta, the wife of Louis's younger brother, the Duke of Orleans. A devoted Catholic, she longed before all things that her brothers might likewise find the true road to salvation. She had succeeded with James. She now succeeded with Charles. On January 25th, 1669, the king, in strict secrecy, announced his conversion to Arlington, Clifford, and Arundel. He now placed the entire conduct of the proposed alliance in the hands of Arlington and Colbert. Buckingham, as a Protestant and a babbler, was excluded from all participation in the grand secret. Personal negotiations were at once opened with Louis. It was understood that if Charles would join the French monarchy against the Dutch, he should be assisted in every way to establish an uncontrolled authority in England and to declare his conversion. The frequent journeys of messengers between London and Paris soon aroused public notice and jealousy. It was openly declared in the streets that a compact was already concluded, and the price was named for which English honour had been bought and sold. Charles was already, he wrote to his sister in June 1669, making formidable preparations. He was rapidly fortifying the principal ports of the kingdom and placing them in sure hands. The number of his troops was being cautiously increased, and he could fully rely upon their devotion. Lauderdale, his viceroy in Scotland, had created an army of 22,000 men, bound by Act of Parliament to march when and whither he pleased within his dominions. Ireland, too, under Berkeley, was in good hands. He was resolved to proclaim his conversion the moment he felt safe. But it is easy to reckon Charles's words at too high a rate. A fixed resolve was utterly foreign to his nature, and day by day, as his character deteriorated under continual debauchery, he grew less capable of sustained effort. Time after time we see him forming great designs and proceeding with them, just so long as they do not meet with a formidable resistance. Careless as he always appeared of public opinion, he never deceived himself for long as to the facts of his position. He never forgot his father's fate, and, as he humorously said, he had no intention of again going on his travels. Temple, meanwhile, was doing his best to sustain the alliance which his master had determined to betray. At his instigation, the States General formally complained to Louis on behalf of Spain of infractions of the Treaty of X La Chapelle. Louis replied in the language of insult. To the Dutch he said he refused any explanation, but he would willingly listen to any communication from the King of England. Charles, though to satisfy Louis he repudiated Temple's action, was much disquieted. To obtain the supplies he needed from Parliament, he felt that he must be able to assure them with verbal accuracy that the Triple Alliance was firm, and that there was no danger of further attack upon the Spanish Low Countries. It was arranged, therefore, that Louis should request Charles to act as mediator between him and Spain in the disputes which had arisen, and that by including Sweden in the arbitration, the opportunity should be taken to separate her interest from that of the Dutch. Sweden, meanwhile, angry at the delay in the payment by Spain of the promised subsidies, was threatening to withdraw her guarantee of the Peace of Aix la Chapelle. De Witt, therefore, urged Charles to maintain the coalition by offering his security to Sweden that her claims should be satisfied, and Charles, to avoid increasing De Witt's growing suspicions, and for the reason already mentioned, thought it prudent to give way. Meanwhile some amusing fencing had taken place between Charles and Colbert upon the question whether the king's declaration of war against the Republic should precede or follow the announcement of his conversion. The object of Louis was to attack the Dutch at the earliest moment. Charles was in no haste to bind himself to the costs and risks of a great war. Upon the religious question he said he could reckon upon the neutrality of the Dissenters, for they hated the Church more than they hated Catholicism. With his troops and fortresses he should be strong enough to carry the matter through. Colbert laid stress upon the fact that in such a case the Dutch would stand before Europe as the champions of the Protestant cause, while the difficulties which would necessarily arise at home would prevent the king from using his strength for the war. But if, sustained by the commercial jealousy of his own people, he first declared war, he would have good ground for demanding supplies. With the troops and ships thus provided, he would find it easy, at the close of a successful conflict, to secure a quiet acquiescence in his conversion. To Charles's next suggestion, that Louis should first begin hostilities, and that he himself should then carry out both parts of his scheme simultaneously, Louis replied with an absolute refusal to begin the war without the explicit concurrence of England. Louis had been well served by the conduct of the English Parliament, which met on October 19, 1669. Charles, in asking for a supply, had prided himself upon being the happy instrument which had secured the Triple Alliance and the Peace of X La Chapelle. He had used language which, though not verbally mendacious, since there was no intention of breaking the Treaty of X La Chapelle, was intended to lead to the belief that the Triple Alliance was equally firm. The fraud was a vain one. Disregarding his appeals for supply and for the payment of his debts, the Commons voted the inadequate sum of £400,000. Charles at once decided to go on with the negotiations with Louis. On December 18, 1669, Arlington submitted to Louis demands which did credit to Charles's audacity. The declaration of Catholicism was to precede the war at a date settled by Charles himself. For this Louis was to give him £200,000 and armed help, should it prove necessary, against his own subjects. For the war, in which he was to join only when England had been pacified, he was to receive £800,000 a year. At its conclusion, Minorca, Ostend, Walcheren, Sluis, and Cadsund, with Spanish America at a future time, were to pass into his hands. The interests of the Prince of Orange were to be preserved, and the Peace of X La Chapelle maintained. On his side, Charles was to support Louis by land and sea in the Dutch war, and when the time came, in making good his claim on the Spanish monarchy. He was for the present to maintain 6,000 infantry in the French service. Louis replied that rather than agree to such preposterous terms he would wait until he could do the work himself. Charles was, however, only playing a game of brag. On January 24, 1670, he made further proposals which for the first time convinced Louis that he was in earnest. They contained one provision, however, which showed how well Charles knew the temper of his people. He told Louis bluntly that no English captain would take orders from a French admiral. If therefore the fleets were united, they must sail under English command. The reconciliation which he secured with Parliament in the session of February 10, 1670, with its practical result in the vote of £300,000 a year for 7 years, greatly strengthened Charles' position in these negotiations. He now began to hang back from the alliance and to raise his terms, and on every point — commercial advantages, the command and numbers of the fleet, the payment of subsidies in hard cash and not in letters of exchange, even his demand that in the powers given to the commissioners he should be styled King of France Louis found himself compelled to yield. His compliance was hastened by the action of De Witt, who had at length become convinced that treason to the Triple Alliance was being hatched in London. The Grand Pensionary determined to send his leading diplomatist, Van Beuningen, to ascertain the truth and frustrate, if he could, any such design. Louis, who knew Van Beuningen's reputation for persuasiveness, resolved to anticipate the visit. No one, he felt, was so likely to overcome Charles's reluctance in the few remaining difficulties as his sister Henrietta. Her influence over her brother was immense, and her hatred of the States General, on account of the dependent position in which they kept her nephew, was keener than that of Charles himself. She more than fulfilled her mission. On May 5th she arrived at Dover, where she was met by Charles, and on June 1st, 1670, Colbert for France, and Arlington, Clifford, Arundel, and Sir Richard Belings from England signed the celebrated Treaty of Dover, the Traité de Madame, as it was often called, though the terms had practically been agreed upon between Arlington and Colbert in March. A fortnight later the ratifications were exchanged. When Van Beuningen arrived, all was over, and nothing remained but to carry out the farce by keeping him in play with feigned negotiations, in which Charles's own ministers, Bridgeman, Trevor, and Ashley, were equally his dupes. By this famous compact Louis, at no great cost, secured his immediate object. The Triple Alliance was broken up. England was to join in war upon the Republic, and Louis was to choose the moment of declaration. An English land force was to serve under French command and in French pay, and when there should arise a failure in the Spanish male line, Charles was to help Louis by sea and land to make good his claims upon that monarchy. But Charles was, except for honour, no loser by the bargain, nor, he might claim, was England. He was indeed to declare his conversion, but while he was at once to receive £150,000 to aid him in any difficulties which might arise, the date was left entirely to himself. So long as the war lasted, he was to receive £225,000 a year, and at its conclusion Walcheren, Sluis, and Cadsand, giving him the command of the coasts of Zealand, were to be his share of the spoil. The treaty of commerce was to be immediately concluded, and the peace of Aix la Chapelle maintained. The supremacy of England at sea was marked by the condition that France was to raise only 30 vessels, to be regarded as auxiliaries to the fleet equipped by England, and that the whole should be under the command of an English admiral. End of section 20. Section 21 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmond Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 16. Louis's preparations for the invasion of the United Provinces, Part 2. A new difficulty, giving occasion for one of the most curious pieces of byplay in history, now arose. It was impossible to show the treaty as it stood to those servants of the king who were Protestants, to Buckingham, Lauderdale, Bridgeman, Trevor, Ashley, Ormond, or Rupert. It was equally impossible to keep the secret long. With Buckingham's inordinate vanity, however, to play upon, the matter was very simple. He was allowed to negotiate, in the belief that the suggestion was his own, a fresh treaty. Led on by the flattery of Louis, and still more by the feigned hesitations of Arlington and Colbert, while Charles looked on with infinite amusement, he laboured zealously in preparing a draft, January 1671, differing from the original one in only 2 important respects. All mention of the conversion was omitted, the subsidy offered for that purpose being now added to that to be given for the war. The opportunity was then taken to secure still further advantage to England. Goree and Vorn were added to the places to be given her, and the commander of the English land contingent was to take precedence of all the lieutenant generals of France. Louis had his way on only one point. The nearer that Charles approached the question of Catholicism, the less agreeable grew the prospect. He had indeed spoken confidently of his forces in Scotland and Ireland, but they were composed of Protestants, and on this question would fail him at the pinch. He had regarded this second treaty as a way out of the difficulty, but Louis insisted on a secret article unknown to Buckingham that in this respect the first agreement should stand. The ostensible treaty was then signed by Buckingham, Lauderdale, and Ashley. Thus, among all the immediate advisers of the crown, there was not one who held his hand from this shameless abandonment of an alliance which England had herself sought. The second treaty had fixed the spring of 1672 for the declaration of war. Strangely enough, this was the doing not of Louis but of Charles. He had now two reasons for desiring prompt action. The advisability of settling both the war and the religious question before the next meeting of Parliament was urged upon him by James, and he happened, through the success of his duplicity and through his abandonment of toleration, to be in possession of ample funds. On October 24th, 1670, he had opened Parliament with a speech in which he had carried deception to the furthest point short of absolute falsehood. The reputation he had acquired by the Triple Alliance and the commercial treaties with Spain, France, Denmark, and Savoy was magnified. In a word, so ran the speech, almost all the princes of Europe do seek his Majesty's friendship, as acknowledging they cannot secure, much less improve, their present condition without it. The necessity of raising the navy to proportions which might challenge the daily increasing armaments of France and the Dutch was dwelt upon. Not a hint was dropped that the bonds of the Triple Alliance were likely to be relaxed. The first of Temple's treaties, indeed, which bound England and the Republic to mutual assistance in case of attack, was specially mentioned. Thoroughly deceived, the Commons answered the King's demand for still a further supply by a vote of no less than £800,000. The importance of the Treaty of Dover can scarcely be overrated. In spite of the advantages Charles had extorted, Louis was the real gainer. Charles had entered upon a course which, becoming more and more one of subservience to France, placed it henceforth in the power of Louis to neutralize the influence of English opinion, and even to enlist the material support of England in the interests of despotism and Catholicism. This political profligacy was responsible for the miseries to which for more than a generation Europe was subjected. Without England, Louis would not have dared to attack the Dutch, for the fleets of the Republic would have swept his commerce from the seas, while the cordial union of the two great naval powers would have stood like a wall against his schemes of aggression. Had England at this moment possessed a king of lofty temper, proud to lead and apt to control the current of national feeling, the chapter of bloodshed and desolation which began at Dover and ended at Utrecht would probably have remained unwritten. 2. Treaty with Sweden and the princes of the Empire. Louis had now lopped the principal limb from the Triple Alliance. He determined to detach the Swedes also. For a long while his success seemed doubtful. They would be glad, they said, to see the naval power of the Republic crippled, but they had no wish to see her ruined. To overcome their scruples, Charles, at Louis's request, sent Henry Coventry in October 1671 to support the French ambassador Courtin. Between Courtin and Coventry on the one hand, and the ambassadors of Spain, Austria, Brandenburg, and the Republic on the other, a daily diplomatic duel was waged for several months. Sweden was poor, and the more she was courted, the higher she pressed her terms. This gave a decisive advantage to the longer purse and the clearer purpose of Louis. On May 6, 1672, he secured a treaty for 3 years, by which Sweden agreed to oppose any princes of the Empire who might attack him, to send 16,000 men into Pomerania in order to defend his line of march, and to regard any breach of neutrality on the part of Dutch garrisons in places belonging to the Empire as a declaration of war. For this she was to receive £100,000 at once, and £150,000 a year during the war. Her jealousy of Denmark, so great, said Lionne, that their dogs would not hunt in company, was expressed by the demand that Louis should guarantee the present peace between them, but that Denmark should not enter the alliance except by the mutual consent of France and Sweden. Almost as important to Louis were the treaties which in July 1671 he succeeded in forming at Hanover, Cologne, Munster, and Osnabrück. By lavish subsidies and the promise of a share in the spoil, he secured a free passage for his troops and the right of purchasing stores, while similar advantages were to be refused to any forces which might be sent by Leopold to the aid of the Dutch. The Elector of Brandenburg, however, who was an ardent Protestant, and the other princes of his family rejected the proposals of Louis. 3. Treaty of Neutrality with Leopold. In all these cases the diplomacy of Louis had been assisted by at least an apparent community of interest. It was far different with the negotiations which he had begun early in 1668 with the Emperor Leopold, first to restrain him from joining the Triple Alliance, and later to secure his neutrality when France attacked the Dutch. De Gremonville, the negotiator of the Partition Treaty, was entrusted with this affair also. He was alternately assisted and hindered by the character of Leopold and the state of his councils. The Emperor, originally destined for the Church, had the tastes and bearing of a recluse. So irresolute was he that his ministers declared him to be only a statue which people could carry about and put up at their pleasure. From week to week he wavered in his plans, as the arguments of de Gremonville and the pressure of Spain and the Dutch, personal pique, the force of old connections, the influence of his mother, his position as head of the Empire, and the internal dissensions of his heterogeneous kingdom acted upon his mind. From the date of the Triple Alliance, de Gremonville carried on single-handed and with inexhaustible skill and temper a daily contest against all the influences adverse to France. His plan was to give Leopold no rest, but by placing before him proposals which followed one another as fast as each was rejected, to keep him in a constant state of nervous anxiety, incessantly craving audiences which Leopold could not refuse, or conferring with his ministers, whose rivalry he knew well how to foster and utilize. He positively bewildered them with the innumerable arguments furnished to him by Louis and Lionne, and by his own astuteness. Unruffled by any insult and undeterred by any temporary check, with absolute confidence both in his master and in himself, he was the one stable element in the sea of warring interests by which he was surrounded. Not until February 1670, however, could he claim any important success beyond that of restraining Leopold from taking decisive action. Even then the Emperor's promise that he would not enter the Triple Alliance was but a spoken one. He had, however, expressed himself willing to leave the Dutch to their fate, provided Louis would promise not to attack Spain, and Louis had hastened to cut the ground from under his feet by writing publicly to the Pope, engaging not to do so for at least a year. Further progress was now delayed by the masterful action of Louis himself. Charles IV, the errant Duke of Lorraine, restored to his estates by the Peace of the Pyrenees, had in 1662 formally handed them over to Louis, on condition that the princes of Lorraine should be recognised as members of the royal family of France. He received them again in 1663, upon giving up Marsal, the key of the country, and admitting the sovereignty of Louis to the great road from Metz to Alsace, with a league's breadth of country the whole of its length. In August 1670, however, Louis heard that the Duke was intriguing against him with the Dutch and the electors of Trèves and Mayence. Not sorry for the excuse, Louis declared the treaty dissolved by this act, poured troops into Lorraine, and in a few days had overrun the country. This new aggression roused the utmost resentment at Vienna. Not only was Lorraine a dependency of the Empire, but Charles IV. Was the brother-in-law of Leopold. The refusal of Louis to attend to all remonstrances, the reproaches of the German princes, and the threats of Spain that, as he had abandoned his family interests, they would abandon him, once more turned the Emperor's fickle resolution against France. Louis now directed de Gremonville to employ his utmost efforts to secure a written promise of neutrality when the attack on the Dutch took place. But this, in his present mood, the Emperor refused to give. Hereupon Louis for the first time indulged in threats. Since Leopold reserved to himself the liberty of helping the enemies of France, he should claim a similar freedom for himself. The effect was immediate, for the Emperor knew that it would be easy at any moment for Louis to stir up war in Hungary. He therefore promised his neutrality so long as neither the Empire nor Spain were attacked. Even then it required the further threat of an immediate abandonment of the negotiations to overcome the dilatoriness of the Imperial Court. It was not until November 1671 that, thoroughly wearied out, Leopold signed a treaty promising that, in case of the expected war, he would not interfere, provided that the peace of Aix la Chapelle were preserved. And thus was completed the circle of negotiations by which Louis had, during nearly 4 years, been engaged in securing that when he attacked the Republic she should look around her in vain for support. The ability and firmness with which his purpose had been maintained were as remarkable as that purpose was unscrupulous and base. End of section 21. Section 22 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmond Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 17. Charles II and the Cabal, 1671-72. 1. The Cabal. The prorogation of April 22nd, 1671, left Charles once more free from parliamentary control. The manner in which, aided by the peculiar character of the executive government, he used his liberty, led to the great crisis of his reign. The Privy Council, which in theory was always consulted, had been found to be an inconveniently large body. It had become the custom, therefore, to form within it a small committee or cabal, a term at least as old as the reign of James I, of the members most in the king's confidence, to which were referred not only foreign affairs, for which it was primarily intended, but all matters of importance and secrecy. This cabal has been regarded as the origin of the present cabinet, but the cabinet is representative of the people, at any rate of the House of Commons, possibly in antagonism to the personal wishes of the Crown, whereas the cabal was the representative of the Crown, often in spite of both Commons and people, neither existing nor ceasing to exist with any direct reference to their opinion. Each member held his place purely at the king's will. He gave his advice, but his duty then was to support whatever decision the king might choose to adopt. The cabal at the time of the Treaty of Dover practically consisted of Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley, and Lauderdale, though Bridgeman, Trevor, Ormond, Rupert, and others were at times included. It was soon noticed that the initial letters of these first 5 names made up the word cabal, and it is therefore to this particular cabal that the title has been specifically attached. Among the 5 there was, besides the guilty knowledge of one or other of the treaties of Dover, but one bond of union. All of them, though from the most various motives, were in favour of toleration. Sir Thomas Clifford was perhaps the most picturesque figure of the cabal, a valiant, incorrupt gentleman, ambitious, not covetous, passionate, a most constant, sincere friend. An ardent Catholic in sympathies, if not by actual conversion, he was as ardent an advocate of an uncontrolled monarchy. Only in the combination of religious freedom and royal despotism did he see salvation for the state. His temper was vehement, his eloquence striking, his personal courage conspicuous. The story is well known how during the former war, when on a visit to Arlington at Euston in Suffolk, he and Ormond's son Ossory, hearing the guns off Norwich, leaped on their horses, galloped to the coast, and put off in an open boat to join the fleet and serve as volunteers through one of the bloodiest days in English naval warfare. Though a poor man, his hands were clean of bribes, and his life was remarkably pure. His horoscope foretold him fame and fortune, but an early death. He answered that he cared not for an early death, if before he died he might witness the triumph of the Catholic Church. Anthony Ashley Cooper, Lord Ashley, ancestor of the present Earl of Shaftesbury, had been in the forefront of political life since boyhood. In the days of the Commonwealth he had striven against Cromwell in support of parliamentary government, and after the Protector's death had taken a great share in breaking down the despotism of the army. In spite of his present complicity in Charles's councils, he was still a keen upholder of parliamentary rule. He was violently anti-Catholic, not from any religious convictions, but because, as he expressed it, Popery and slavery go ever like two sisters, hand in hand. But he had been a supporter of every attempt at toleration of Protestant dissent, as being necessary for trade, and in the constitution which, at his request, John Locke drew up for the new colony of Carolina, toleration was a leading feature. He had established a reputation for business power, tact, and finesse, and though he never affected to censure the prevailing private and public immorality, he shunned debauchery in his own person, and, like Clifford, is free from any well-established charge of bribery. Small and slight in stature and of delicate health, he had a soul as ambitious and fiery as that of Clifford himself, and it was not until the end of his career that his keen political foresight gave way under the excitement of faction and the harassments of ill health. But though he possessed an intuitive perception of those causes which had a great future before them, his conduct was always liable to be modified by the determination to ride on the crest of the political wave, and while from his ready and incisive eloquence, his unceasing activity, and his skill in party warfare, which in its modern form he may be said to have originated, he was always formidable, he is far more often spoken of with distrust than with admiration or respect. John Maitland, Duke of Lauderdale, was only in the second place an English politician. He was Charles's irresponsible and almost absolute Viceroy of Scotland, at a time when Scotland was completely separated in sympathies from England. He was, too, the king's devoted personal adherent, eager to carry out his slightest wishes, which he affirmed were more to him than all human laws, and to pander to his most shameless vices. Utterly dissolute as he was in morals and religion, his early career as a Presbyterian caused him to be regarded as a Protestant, and as such he was excluded from knowledge of the Catholic plot. There is one other person whose influence was more powerful and lasting than that of the professional politicians. This was a young Breton girl of noble family, who came over in the train of Henrietta, and who, by the beauty of her baby face and a winning charm of manner and conversation, which formed a piquant contrast to the vulgar humours of Lady Castlemaine and Nell Gwynn, completely captivated Charles. It is more than probable that Louis had determined that some permanent representative of French influence should have a place in that scene of female caprice which surrounded Charles's most intimate life, and that it was this which Louise de Keroualle was to supply. She soon became the chief intermediary between the monarchs, sharing in all their schemes of statecraft, and displaying an independence of judgment and a capacity for intrigue worthy of a practised politician. her influence was recognized by the hatred with which she was popularly regarded as the agent of France. Upon Louise de Keroualle, better known as the Duchess of Portsmouth, as upon the other women of Charles's harem, the treasure of the country was poured out in reckless profusion. It was not without good reason that a caricature published in Holland represented the king between two women with his pockets turned inside out. The supplies voted by Parliament, the subsidies of Louis, ran like water through the hands of these female favourites. Pensions, patents, monopolies, crown lands, reversions of lucrative posts were showered upon them and their children. Louise de Keroualle alone had before long an annual income of £40,000, and in 1681 the enormous sum of £136,000 passed through her hands. It is no wonder that, this being but one form of expenditure on his pleasures, the sums received by Charles were all too small, and that in August 1671 his debts were reckoned at more than 3 millions. 2. Stop of the Exchequer, declaration of Indulgence, Dutch war. A state of things so desperate, with an expensive war in prospect, suggested desperate remedies. All evidence points to Clifford as the author of the confession of national bankruptcy known as the Stop of the Exchequer, though it is possible that a similar step by Mazarin may have suggested it to Charles. It was customary for the bankers to advance money to the crown on the faith of taxes voted by Parliament, but not yet collected, at an interest of 12%. It was now determined in the Privy Council, though against the advice of Ashley, to apply the whole proceeds of the taxes for 1672 to the war, the bankers being left unpaid, while for the future the interest on the money thus confiscated should be reduced to 6%. The sum upon which by this outrageous breach of faith Charles laid violent hands, £1,400,000, was secured at the cost of the permanent ruin of the royal credit and general commercial distress. Hundreds of private persons were left destitute, for the bankers were compelled to suspend payment, and merchants who had placed money in their hands were unable to carry on their ordinary business. And after all, says a shrewd observer, as it did not supply the expenses of the meditated war, so it melted away, I know not how. For carrying through this scheme, the flagrant dishonesty of which was evidently obscured by his view of the proper privileges of royalty, Clifford was rewarded with a peerage and the Lord Treasurer's staff. The second important measure which signalized the spring of 1672 must be laid to the credit of Ashley. Trusting, no doubt, that at the close of the war he would be in a position to dictate his own terms to Parliament, Charles made another attempt to secure the dispensing power. On March 15, 1672, he published the famous Declaration of Indulgence. It was evidently drawn up by Ashley, whose often expressed views were thus set forth in the preamble: "We do now issue this our declaration, as well for the quieting of our good subjects as for inviting strangers in this conjuncture to come and live under us, and for a better encouragement of all to a cheerful following of their trades and callings." Charles then boldly claimed the dispensing power. Looking to the unhappy differences in matters of religion, he declared himself obliged to make use of that supreme power in ecclesiastical matters which is not only inherent in us, but hath been declared and recognized to be so by several statutes and acts of Parliament. In the vain hope of conciliating the Church, the declaration stipulated that the doctrine, discipline, privileges, and government of the Church, as now established, should be scrupulously observed. The suspension of all manner of penal laws and matters ecclesiastical against whatsoever sort of nonconformists or recusants was announced, while in pursuance of a plan adopted by Louis with marked success, but which had been on a former occasion rejected by the Commons, certain places were to be licensed for the worship of nonconforming Protestants. Catholics, however, were to be allowed only their former liberty to hold services in their private houses. The issue of the Declaration had been hindered by the conduct of Orlando Bridgeman, Keeper of the Seals. That honest minister had already made difficulties in the matter of the stop of the Exchequer. He now absolutely refused to put the Great Seal to the Declaration. The opportunity was taken to reward its author. Bridgeman was removed, and Ashley, under the title of Earl of Shaftesbury, was made Lord Chancellor. 2 days after the issue of the Declaration, the last great step for which the members of the Cabal were jointly responsible was taken. On March 17th, war was declared against the Dutch. End of section 22. Section 23 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmond Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 18. The Dutch Republic before the war. The Republic had risen with remarkable elasticity from the exhaustion of the late war. A national debt of 12.5 millions sterling was borne with ease. Her population was rapidly increasing, her commerce was expanding in every quarter of the globe, and her traders were displaying their former exclusiveness. But this absorption in the search for wealth, and their apparent immunity from foreign invasion, forbade in her people that spirit of watchfulness and that readiness to sink individual interests in the national welfare which result from the constant imminence of danger. The character of the Dutch, said De Witt, is such that they will take no steps for defence until the danger stares them in the face. With all this apparent prosperity, there existed in the claims of the Prince of Orange an abiding source of political instability. De Witt had indeed secured the charge of his education as a ward of the state, and was sedulously training him, as Mazarin trained Louis, to be fit to govern. The Perpetual Edict of January 1668 and the Act of Harmony which followed had secured the separation of the civil and military commands, for the Stadtholderate was abolished in Holland, while in the other provinces it was rendered incompatible with the offices of Captain or Admiral General of the Republic, offices which the Prince was to occupy only when he reached the age of 22. With the sympathy, however, of both Louis and Charles, he soon began to act for himself. Escaping in September 1668 from De Witt's surveillance, he hastened to Zeeland, where his party was strong, and was received with enthusiasm. In 1670 De Witt was compelled to assent to his taking his seat on the Council of State, and to his visiting England. As war grew imminent, his claims became more acceptable. The past was forgotten, except that under the leadership of his house independence had been won. The army and navy were enthusiastic in his favour. In the spring of 1672, after taking an oath to maintain the Perpetual Edict, and with many limitations, he was made Captain General for one campaign, the office to be continued for life should it seem fitting when he had completed his 22nd year. The Admiralty, so long as Ruyter was there to lead the fleet, was held in reserve. De Witt offered a signal example of the truth of his own saying. He could not bring himself to believe that his work was so soon to perish, though mysterious warnings had reached him as early as February 1668. When, however, his offers to assist Louis in his eventual designs upon Spain, and to settle the Spanish Low Countries favourably to French interests, were slightingly passed by, and a complimentary address from the States General to Louis in Flanders in the spring of 1671 was received with studied coldness. When Louis refused to include the Republic in the arbitration concerning his alleged infractions of the Peace of X La Chapelle, when the French ambassador was removed from The Hague and no successor sent, when heavy duties were imposed upon Dutch goods entering France, and all attempts at retaliation treated with contempt, the truth came upon him with terrible clearness. In January 1672 he made a final appeal to Louis, offering to disarm completely if he would do the same and would remove the hostile tariffs. Louis replied that he should complete his preparations and should use his forces as best befitted his dignity. The awakening to the treachery of Charles had been still slower and more painful. Here, too, he had tried every means of conciliation. Hearing of the king's irritation at the pamphlets, medals, and triumphal pictures which glorified the Chatham achievement, and especially that the captured royal Charles was made a common show, he had the moulds of the medals broken, the pamphlets as far as possible suppressed, the royal arms removed from the vessel, and her name altered, concessions which were viewed merely as signs of weakness. The recall of Temple in July 1671 was made the occasion for a wanton insult to the Dutch. The captain of the yacht sent to bring back Lady Temple was ordered by Charles to sail through their fleet in the Channel, to insist upon their lowering their flags, and in case of refusal to take such action as would compel them to fire upon him and so appear the aggressors, a scheme frustrated only by the self-restraint of the Dutch admiral, Van Ghent. In December, Downing, a well-known enemy of the Republic, was sent to succeed Temple as ambassador to the Hague, with instructions to bring about a rupture. In the most offensive terms he demanded reparation for the insults of which Charles complained, and specifically insisted upon the acknowledgment of the maritime supremacy of England over all seas, going so far as to require that whole fleets should lower their flags to a single English warship. Even to this outrageous demand De Witt was willing to give way, provided the king would engage to assist the Republic against France. As late as March 3, 1672, he endeavoured to conjure away the danger by the offer of a heavy personal bribe to Charles. Charles had wished to appear as the attacked party. When he found the attempt useless, he began hostilities by an act which Louis himself contemptuously characterized as sheer piracy. The Dutch merchant fleet from Smyrna was lying at anchor off the Isle of Wight. Admiral Holmes was ordered to attack without warning and to capture the convoy. But the Dutch were prepared, and after a severe engagement (March 13th), the fleet escaped with the loss of only 2 vessels. War was declared by England 4 days later. As danger approached, the Dutch had done their best to secure allies, but their proverbial thriftiness stood much in their way. They might undoubtedly have anticipated France in securing Sweden, had they been as open-handed as Louis. Only in 2 quarters did they gain any important success. The Grand Elector of Brandenburg, the most powerful of the German princes, had been induced, through his vehement Protestantism and his jealousy of the proximity of French troops, to sign a treaty in February 1671, which became effectual in April 1672, when he promised to aid the Republic with 22,000 men, and his adhesion brought with it that of the Elector of Mayence. Spain, too, convinced that if the United Provinces fell into the hands of Louis nothing could save her Low Countries, concluded with the Dutch a treaty of mutual defence. But even so, the case of the Republic seemed desperate against the forces which Louis was prepared to launch upon her. The retrenchment of expenses after the peace had been unwisely made upon the army. No less than 41,000 men had then been disbanded. Obligatory service had become a dead letter. Among the troops that remained there was little discipline. The best among the officers had resigned their commissions in consequence of their sympathies with the cause of William. The commissariat was disorganized, the fortifications were in decay, and the country was almost denuded of military stores. When war was declared, there were, in spite of De Witt's utmost efforts, but 52,000 men with the standards. These were placed under William as captain general, with Frederick of Nassau, his natural uncle, and John Maurice, the Rhinegrave, then a man of 65 years of age, in charge of infantry and cavalry respectively. With these miserable forces the Republic prepared to confront as best it could an army of 176,000 men, led by Condé, Turenne, Luxembourg, and the great engineer Vauban, and admirably equipped in every arm. This was the escort which, as Louis said, permitted him to travel safely in the United Provinces. To face Ruyter's fleet of 135 ships he trusted chiefly to England, but he had himself collected 120 vessels mounted with 5,000 guns. As a retort to the medal which so aroused his anger, he caused another to be struck, in which the sun was portrayed dispersing the frogs from a marsh, and bearing as its motto, in allusion to the fact that it was through French assistance that the Republic had been created, the words Evexi sed discutiam, I raised them up, and I will disperse them. End of section 23. Section 24 of the English Restoration and Louis XIV by Osmond Airy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 19. Invasion of the United Provinces, Part 1. 1. French occupation. Louis had spoken of travelling safely in the United Provinces, but none really regarded the enterprise as a light one. Condé, who was not wont to count danger highly, confessed the anxiety he felt. He even prophesied disaster. Temple compared Louis to a strong swimmer who plunges full of confidence in the water, but a strong current, the wasting of his strength, or an accident will surely sweep him away. Every provision was made for a difficult and dangerous expedition. The magnificent force collected at Charleroi was complete throughout its equipment. Vast stores were laid up at Neuss, a little below Cologne, and the labour of transport thus saved over half the route. Had De Witt been seconded with ability, this advantage would have been wanting to Louis. He had sent a detachment of cavalry to surprise Neuss, but the lack of discipline among the men, who betrayed their approach by a continuous fusillade upon the fowls and geese along the route, frustrated the design. His project for anticipating the declaration of war by entering Brest, Rochelle, and other open French ports, and destroying the ships which were being fitted out there, was rendered futile by the want of a strong central authority. The jealousy of Zealand caused the failure of a still bolder design. This was no less than to repeat the Chatham exploit, to sail up the Thames before the English fleet could issue out, and there, in the heart of his kingdom, challenge the power of Charles. Before the Zealand squadron had joined the fleet, the bulk of the English vessels were out of the river, and though Van Ghent, with a number of light ships, reached Sheerness, he could not force a further passage. Two routes were before Louis, by the Meuse or by the Rhine. Blocking the former stood Maastricht, a strong fortress garrisoned by Dutch troops. Supposing this obstacle overcome, and the line of the Meuse followed, the army would be confronted before it entered Dutch territory by the Waal, a deep and wide river defended at the crossing point by Nimwegen. If the Rhine route were chosen, it would be necessary to capture 4 fortresses: Orsoy, Rheinberg, Wesel, and Burick, then in Dutch hands. Following the right bank, the army would finally have to cross the Isel, which leaves the Rhine just above Arnheim. It was determined to adopt the latter of these two plans. On May 5th Louis joined the army at Charleroi. Marching swiftly along the Sambre, he led his forces near Liège on the Meuse. On the 15th, Maassek, a little north, and Tongeren, a little south of Maastricht, was taken and garrisoned, that place being thus completely masked. Passing the Meuse at Visé, Louis reached his magazines at Neuss on the 31st. Here the army was divided, Condé crossing the Rhine at Kaiserwerth. On June 2nd the fortresses were simultaneously attacked. By the 6th, Turenne had taken Orsoy, Burick, and Rheinberg on the left bank, while Wesel on the right surrendered to Condé. Crossing at Wesel, Turenne rejoined Condé, and on the 11th the whole force was before the Isel, faced by William with all the troops he could muster. Condé now offered to wager that he would force a passage with a loss of less than 400 men. A plan even less dangerous was adopted. By crossing at Tolhuis, between the outflows of the Waal and the Yssel, the whole army might easily be placed in the region between the Waal and the Rhine, known as the Betuwe. Robbed of the volume of the Waal, the river is here easily fordable by cavalry. William had moreover neglected to defend it in force. The celebrated passage of the Rhine, therefore, which, graced by the young monarch's presence, aroused such enthusiasm in France, has been described by Napoleon as an operation of the fourth order. It was made with only one serious mishap. Condé, as he led the dash into the river, was wounded in the wrist, and could take no further part in the advance. The next day a bridge was thrown over, and the whole army crossed into the Betuwe. The line of the Yssel being thus turned, William fell back towards Amsterdam with the regiments of Holland, Guelders, and Utrecht, numbering some 12,000 men. The rest refused to take part in the defence of any province but their own, and were left uselessly cooped up in Arnheim, Nimwegen, and the Yssel fortresses. Had Louis followed Condé's advice and sent his cavalry straight upon Amsterdam, the campaign would probably have ended at a blow. Yielding, however, to the presumption of Louvois, he ordered Turenne to complete the conquest of the Betuwe, while himself, after investing Nimwegen, crossed the Rhine once more below Arnheim, took that town, and proceeded leisurely to reduce the Yssel forts. The mistake was well nigh redeemed by the enterprise of the Count of Rochefort, who with 1,800 men made a dash for Molden, within sight of Amsterdam, in order to secure the sluices, passing William and capturing, as he sped on, Reuss, Amersfoort, and Naarden. A few of his men reached Molden, only to find that at the critical moment John Maurice had thrown in a garrison. Returning on his track, Rochefort on June 23rd entered Utrecht, which William had abandoned when the inhabitants refused to sacrifice their gardens and villas for its defence. Louis, however, in spite of the check at Molden, felt sure of his prey. Advancing from the Yssel, he took up his quarters at Utrecht, published a proclamation calling upon the towns which still held out to surrender, under the severest penalties of war, and waited for the submission of Amsterdam. But that submission never came. As early as April the supreme necessity had been foreseen by De Witt. All had been in readiness to open the sluices and cut the dykes. On June 15th the memorable resolution was come to. By the 18th the sacrifice was consummated. The sea poured in, placing a waste of water between Louis and Amsterdam, and the province of Holland, at least, was saved. The citizens worked with the intensest energy to provide for their defence. The archives and state treasures were transferred thither from The Hague, and the States General held their sittings there. The mills were set to grind powder instead of corn. The regiments which had followed William were taken into the pay of Holland. Every fourth man among the peasantry was enlisted. Marines and gunners were drawn from the fleet. A strong force was sent to guard the shores of the Zuyder Zee, while a swarm of light vessels rendered any attempt of the French ships to make use of the inundation hopeless. The resolution of the men of Holland rose day by day, now that they were fighting for their own province. The Republic had been well nigh lost through the want of imperial spirit. It was now saved by the vigour of local patriotism. A gleam of light came from Zeeland. Louis had left behind him a strong force near Ath to watch the Spanish Low Countries. Their commander, hearing that Aardenburg, which guarded the entry into Zeeland, was weakly garrisoned, marched through Spanish territory with 5,000 men and suddenly appeared before the town. Attacking with his advanced guard, he was driven back with loss. A second assault with his whole force was even more disastrous, while to complete his discomfiture the captain of a Zeeland vessel landed his crew of 200 men, and by a vigorous flank attack so well seconded a sortie of the garrison that the French were compelled to retreat with great loss in killed and prisoners. By this spirited feat of arms Zealand was placed in safety, and French troops were shown to be not invincible. Thus saved on land by a desperate appeal to nature, the Republic had been saved at sea by the valour of her sailors. On June 7th Ruyter encountered the united fleets of France and England in Southwold Bay. At 7 in the morning they joined battle. Ruyter, with whom was Cornelius de Witt, held the centre. He ordered the pilot to lay his vessel, the Seven Provinces, alongside James's flagship, the Prince, while Bancas and Van Ghent attacked the French squadron under Estrees and the English left wing under the Earl of Sandwich respectively. Within 2 hours the Prince was so shattered that James, among whose faults a lack of personal bravery can never be numbered, was compelled to row off under the fire of the enemy and hoist his flag upon the St. Michael. Before the day ended the St. Michael too sank under him, and he barely escaped to the London. On the English right Estrees fell back pursued by Bancas, while on the left a terrible fight raged throughout the long summer's day. Van Ghent was killed early in the action. Sandwich, after a desperate resistance to overwhelming attacks, perished with his son by the sinking of the boat in which they were rowing to another ship. Ruyter, who had been seriously endangered by the absence of Bancas, recovered ascendancy late in the evening, and when night fell the English were falling back with a loss of 5 ships of the line, 2,500 men, and no fewer than 18 captains. A dense fog prevented Ruyter from pushing his victory next day, but he had done his work. He had, at the critical moment, preserved the coasts of the Republic from attack, and was able to give his attention to secure the safe harbouring of the East India fleet. 2. The Orange Reaction. Murder of the De Witts. The prospect of final rescue was, however, so dim that the States General determined to negotiate with Louis. When their deputation reached his camp at Doesburg on the Yssel, they were told by Louvois that satisfaction for the allies of France and the payment of the entire expenses of the war were necessary preliminaries to a treaty. The States General were disposed to yield, but the deputies of Amsterdam and the Provincial Estates of Holland stood firm. Come what might, they declared that they would have no part in such a submission. In the vehement discussions which had arisen, De Witt had had no share. Each day of misfortune had led more definitely to his fall. A unity of command grew indispensable. The restoration of the Stadtholderate was demanded with increasing insistence, and to this restoration he was regarded as the main obstacle. The most atrocious calumnies, especially from the pulpits of the Calvinistic clergy, who were vehemently in William's interests, were levelled against him. He was accused of being an accomplice of Louis, and of having sent to Venice a large sum of public money for his own use. On June 21st he was attacked in the streets and left for dead, and on the same day an attempt was made at Dordrecht upon the life of his brother Cornelius. One of the ruffians was captured and hung. The others, who were well known, found, to William's disgrace, a safe refuge in his camp. This deed only stimulated the reaction. One by one the towns of Zealand and then of Holland proclaimed William the Stadtholder. He was summoned to Dordrecht, where he found the streets gay with orange and white flags, the white in punning reference to the Grand Pensionary's name below the orange. On July 1st the Provincial Estates of Holland and Zealand sent to the towns, where it was received with enthusiasm, their vote for the abrogation of the Perpetual Edict, and on July 6th the Prince was proclaimed Stadtholder by both provinces, with all the privileges of his ancestors, the election of the mayors of towns being alone reserved. In this vote Guelders, Utrecht and Overijssel were unable to concur, since they were in the hands of the French, while Friesland and Groningen retained as Stadtholder the son of their former governor, Henry Casimir of Nassau. At the same time the States General named the Prince, henceforward William III, Captain and Admiral General of the Republic for life, saving the privileges of Henry Casimir. From this moment Louis had to reckon with the resistance not merely of a valiant and stubborn people driven to desperation, but of such a people, swayed by a will as proud and as tenacious as his own. Of this reaction the national need had been the immediate cause. It represented also the triumph of the democratic spirit over the merchant aristocracy, which had so long kept the mass of people, as it had kept William, under its control. A terrible crime now signalized this triumph. The enmity against the De Witts had been disarmed neither by the murderous attack upon them, nor by the dignified address in which, after recounting the services of 19 years, John de Witt resigned to the provincial estates of Holland his charge as Grand Pensionary. The populace determined on a full accomplishment of their design. The blow fell first upon Cornelius, who, accused of plotting the murder of William, was enticed to the Hague, and there, by order of the Court of Holland, put to the torture and ordered to be banished from Holland and West Friesland. As he lay crippled from the rack, the mob surrounded the prison to prevent his departure. By a feigned message his brother was induced to visit him there. Means were found to remove the guards who protected the prison from attack. Then, bursting open the gates, the crowd rushed to the room where the brothers were expecting their fate. They found Cornelius stretched on the bed, while John de Witt read aloud from the Bible. A blow struck the reader on the face and covered him with blood. Then Cornelius was dragged to his feet. Almost before the brothers had exchanged a last kiss, he was hurled to the bottom of the stairs. Pushing their victims before them, the mob rushed into the street, and there the butchery was completed. As John de Witt, struck to the earth, raised himself on his knees, and holding his clasped hands to heaven, opened his lips to utter a last prayer, he was dashed backwards. A man placed his foot upon his throat, and crying aloud, "At last the perpetual edict is repealed," blew out his brains with a pistol. The bodies were stripped and horribly outraged, and then, in the presence of a Calvinistic clergyman, were dragged through the streets to the scaffold and hung by the feet amid the jeers of the people. Upon no one did this foul deed throw more disgrace than upon William. By his ungenerous coldness after the first attack, and by his protection of the assailants, he had made it evident that he was not likely to hinder the bloody work in hand. Not a word escaped him to control the popular passion. When appealed to for troops to quell the riot, he had turned a deaf ear, and when the murder was completed, he not only protected the ringleaders, but actually conferred upon them public preferment. The poor excuse that can be made for him is that by active steps to prevent this blind desire for vengeance, he might have imperilled his newly acquired position. End of Section 24.